Hi, everyone. I'm Sue. I'm going to be talking about hierarchical spatial representations. So I'm generally interested in spatial navigation and spatial exploration. And so the question I'm presenting on today is, what is the functional utility of spatial navigation? And specifically for building hierarchical spatial representations? And what are the underlying mechanisms in the hippocampal complex that might be leading to the formation of these hierarchical representations? And specifically the hippocampal complex, because this is the region of the brain that has been implicated in spatial navigation, right? So it's widely known that there are cells in the hippocampal complex that encode space. So regarding the functional utility, one aspect that hierarchical spatial representations can be useful for is efficient exploration. So we all know that humans are expert explorers and foragers. When we go to a new conference, for instance, in a new country, we have a new venue and we're still able to explore that space efficiently. And so the question we're asking here is, what computations underlie this cognitive ability of humans of exploring new novel spaces efficiently? So I have segmented my talk into three parts. So in the first part, I'm going to talk about exploration, and we are going to explore whether there's any functional advantage for having hierarchical maps. And we'll learn from this part that there are two key components that are necessary. One, high capacity. So if we are to learn multiple spatial maps, we need to store them. And so in the second part of my talk, I'll present a neural model that has a high capacity memory and has a gradual decay in terms of the information that you can recover per memory as you increase the number of memories that you're storing. So it's kind of a neural implementation and a hypothesis for how we could have high capacity memories in the brain. And then the second thing that we learn from map induction is compositional representations. In order to build hierarchical representations, we need the principle of compositionality. And in the third part of my talk, I'll talk about how the Entorhinal-Hippocampal circuit, which has been implicated in encoding spatial maps, can lead to the formation of hierarchical spatial representations. So we can start with map induction. I wouldn't have time to go into the details of map induction, but if you're interested, you can look at the paper. We can start with what we know from cognitive science studies. So here we know from cognitive science that humans have hierarchical representations of space. So for instance, if you think about geography of the world, there's evidence that people represent the geography of the world hierarchically. So for instance, if you ask someone where, for instance, this city Reno is as a relative to Los Angeles, they usually say that it's to the east because they think of Nevada as being to the east of California, but actually it is to the west. So that's evidence that people might be representing these regions hierarchically. Then we also have this, this evidence from the study in 1978, where people represent spaces even with boundaries hierarchically. So if you have objects placed which are separated by either transparent or opaque barriers, then people tend to overestimate the distance between objects separated by barriers and underestimate the distance between objects that are within the same spatial region. And similarly, people represent spaces with unclear boundaries also hierarchically. So if they have subjective clusters that they've formed of spaces, they're still overestimating the distance between, the places in the same geographical region, and then underestimating the distance between things that are, underestimating the distance between spaces in the same clusters and overestimating the distance between spaces in different clusters. So there's also evidence from existing literature that humans construct approximate spatial representations. So they are sacrificing global metric accuracy. So instead of forming globally consistent maps, they form local maps. And this concept has also been used in robotics. So specifically in Atlas and Framework and in segmented SLAM, people form local maps which are connected by certain transformations. And this has been used for mapping large-scale spaces. However, one thing that's unaddressed in the literature is how might you use these local maps recurrently, right? So how can you build the submaps that are reusable such that they can be composed to induce maps of spaces that haven't been seen before? So that's where we come in. We propose a map induction hypothesis, which suggests that humans might be exploring spaces by inducing the maps of spaces based on the regions that they've already seen, right? And also of maps of spaces of similar environments that they might have seen before. So for instance, in a simple example is a berry foraging task, right? When if an agent is exploring a landscape, then in a berry foraging task, one can expect that the landscape of hills would continue in the same fashion, and the distribution of berries in unobserved areas would be similar to that in the observed areas. So more formally, you can think of this as inferring the programs that could have generated an environment given past observations. So this is kind of a program induction framework that we can use to model this. So we test the map induction hypothesis through behavioral experiments. So we conduct 3D spatial environments that are composed in a very structured way and have rewards embedded into them. So what we do is that the subjects are exposed to these environments from a first-person perspective, so they do not have access to the top-down view of these environments. And there are rewards embedded in these environments. And the task of the subjects is to collect the maximum amount of rewards from these environments in the constrained amount of time given to them per trial. So we also formalized the map induction hypothesis using map induction-based planning models that induce maps through composition of map fragments that have been seen before. So this framework is a model-based reinforcement learning setup, which has 4 key components: the region extractor that extracts region primitives from observed parts of the space, and the map generator that uses these region primitives and composes them to form map hypotheses, the map inference that uses Bayesian inference to infer a probability distribution over the generated map hypotheses, and then a planner that takes this probability distribution as input in order to plan the next step in the environment. So for the planner, we use a POMCP-based planner that solves an underlying Markov decision, partially observed Markov decision process using approximate methods like Monte Carlo tree search. And we consider 3 model hypotheses. One is the uniform model. So the uniform model assumes uniform probability for the existence of reward, empty space, or wall in unobserved spaces. So this, you can think of this as an unconstrained large distribution of maps. The maximum a posteriori model looks at these hypotheses generated by the map generator and picks out the most likely hypothesis. And the distributional model takes all of the hypotheses generated by the map generator and uses that to plan the next steps in the environment. So here I'm showing the uniform model. So the uniform model doesn't have any spatial priors, and hence it explores the environment exhaustively. And you can see that it goes into every room in order to figure out where the reward might be. And next I'm showing you the map induction based models on the right. So the light red is basically the induced map, and the red, the darker colors are showing the observed regions of the space. So you can see that in this case, right from the beginning, when the agent enters the environment, it induces the environment based on whatever it has seen so far. And then every time step, it's also updating its estimate of the induced map, because of which it can actually have high preference for areas that it's expecting to find the rewards in. So it can, instead of exploring the environment exhaustively, explore this environment efficiently to find rewards. So we find that map induction is critical for human-like exploration. Here in the top panel, I'm showing representative trajectories from a subject in 3 different environments. And in the bottom panel, I'm showing visitation heat maps of subjects across these environments, averaged across subjects. So you can see that after traversing some part of the environment, the humans directly start going to the rooms that have the reward because of their induction process. And here we can also see that, as expected, the uniform model actually ends up exploring the whole environment exhaustively, whereas the map induction based models explore the environment more efficiently and are closer to humans in terms of the fraction of the environment that they're observing. We can also plot the log likelihood of each of these models conditioned on human behavioral data. And we see that both the maximum a posteriori model and the distributional models, which are both map induction based models, perform better than the uniform model. And both of them are similar in performance. Subsequently, we also find that humans build a distribution of possible maps through map induction. So here, the environments still have rewards embedded into it, but the distribution of rewards is stochastic based on a color cue that's embedded into these environments. And here we see that the distributional model is actually closest to humans in terms of the fraction of environment observed, as well as if we look at the log likelihood of the distributional model as compared to the maximum a posteriori model, we see that the distributional model is more likely conditioned on human data. So this suggests that humans are building a distribution of possible maps. So just to summarize this part, we've seen that humans build a constrained distribution of possible maps through an inductive process rather than a very unconstrained distribution. And map induction is a conceptually new way to think about navigation in this zero and few shot settings. And this significantly improves the performance of state-of-the-art Monte Carlo, partially observed Monte Carlo planners as well. So it can also be used in AI systems. So that summarizes the map induction part. So here we've seen that, yes. Sure, yeah, go for it. Right, right.
There's students on either side, or maybe a river at the bottom or something like that. I don't know. Have you thought about how this is going to generate?
Yes. So even in these simulations, we have a certain uncertainty in terms of the extension of maps. But in general, when I'm thinking of large scale environments, here I'm only using metric regularities. But for large scale environments, I also think about topological regularities. And when you're transitioning from one environment to another, usually the topological regularities would be more likely to be preserved than specific metric regularities. So for instance, if you take the example of this building, there's a 3-loop structure that this building has, right, and which is repeated across the 4th floor, 5th floor, and 6th floor. So that topology is preserved, although the distribution of the rooms across these corridors is different, right? So I think like when we extend this framework, we are thinking more in terms of graph induction, where we are representing spaces, not just in metric sense, but also the topology. And I think the topology will be more, more preserved across large scale environments than just specific dimensions that are metric in building. Natural environments. Okay. So usually when I think about natural environments, I'm also thinking about certain patterns that recur in natural environments. So for instance, this example of landscape and berries, this is traditionally, people might have certain patterns that they notice that, a certain plant grows across on the coast, or, a certain plant grows in this kind of landscape. And so those are the patterns, right? And if we think about man-built natural environments or external environments, then it's the kind of roads that we encounter, the grid structure of the roads, or structures like roundabouts that we are encountering. Those are kind of like, they translate across countries, for instance, right? So if I've learned how to navigate a roundabout here, then I can also take that knowledge and go about it in another country. But yeah, in natural environments, I think like it's mostly like, the patterns that don't necessarily have to be, I think this framework is not just limited also to space, right? Because there are also other patterns that humans notice that they induce in other spaces. Okay, so basically we've seen that one of the main things that are key to map induction is compositionality, right? So we're composing these primitives to form map hypotheses. And the question is, how can these compositional spatial representations be formed at the neural level? The second question is that we are actually learning a lot of maps, right? Humans are learning maps of their residential neighborhoods. We are learning maps of apartment buildings. We are learning maps of our workspaces. We learn maps of the malls we visit and certain parts of the city, like the downtown, which we might occasionally visit. And so the question is, how can we store all of these maps, right? And so for this, the main question that we're posing is, how can we build a high capacity memory system at the neural level, which also exhibits this gradual decay? Because as we are storing more and more memories, there's an upper limit to the capacity of any network. And so instead of just forgetting previous memories and remembering the new memories, what we would like is a gradual decay of the memories as you increase the number of memories that you're storing. So basically, this figure is showing that in a more numerical sense, that as you're increasing the number of patterns, your information that you're recovering per memory should degrade in a smooth fashion. All right, so I think in the next part of the talk, what I'm going to do is talk about this memory model and show you how we can construct such a model that has this key property. So the model is called mesh, memory scaffold with heteroassociation. It's a content addressable memory model. And what I mean by content addressable memory is basically you give it a noisy pattern and the task is to reconstruct the actual memory that was stored in the model initially. So the conjecture is that human-like memory should exhibit a memory continuum. And what I mean by memory continuum is the smooth gradual degradation that I was talking about. So basically, the idea is that you should be able to store few memories in a model that you should be able to completely recover. But as you're storing, increasing the number of memories that you're storing in the network, then the information recovered per memory should gradually decay such that you have complete recovery of memories for small number of memories, and then gradual degradation with increase in memories, such that you have partial recovery of memories when you're storing a large amount of memories. So the key is that you should be able to recover all the memories, and the memories should only be gradually forgotten. And so there are existing content addressable memory models that mostly lack a memory continuum. So for instance, Hopfield network is a fully recurrently connected network that has been a famous model of content addressable memory. And it has an upper bound on its capacity, beyond which, if you try to store more memories, it not only can't store any more memories, but it also forgets all the previous memories catastrophically. Similarly, most of the existing models only form points on this continuum. And what we would like is a model that spans this entire continuum with complete recovery of few memory states and partial recovery of a large number of memory states. And this is what we achieve through a model. Right, so this is the model. We call it mesh, memory scaffold with heteroassociation. So the key conceptual insight from the model is that we are factorizing the memory or the fixed points from the content. So the network is consisting of 3 layers. The first 2 layers implement a memory scaffold, and the third layer is heteroassociatively linked to the scaffold. And so again, just to clarify, the task here is, given a noisy version of this feature states, the model should be able to reconstruct the feature states that were originally stored in this model. Oh, one thing I should also highlight is that basically the label layer is a k-sparse layer, which is randomly projected to form the hidden layer states. And these are fixed states. The back projections from hidden layer to label layer are learned through associative learning. And similarly, the projections between the hidden and feature layers are also learned through associative learning. So these are biologically plausible learning rules and also lead to one-shot learning of each of the memories that we are trying to learn. Sure.
The extent to which there's good evidence that this general framework is a good like way to model the way that doing work. So I'm thinking about like a situation where like, and I feel like oftentimes like you see something or you have some experience, right? And the question is like, is that something that you're still before? And the problem is it's not that the food is not good, but the memory is. How do you think about this in terms of like everyday experience and how?
Right. I think this is related to the concept of pattern completion, right? So it doesn't have to be the exact memory that's noisy, but as long as you're in the same context that evokes the memory, you can reconstruct the same memory. So that's how I usually think that, you know, if you are in a certain context, because usually when we're trying to recollect memories, we are in a certain context and we're trying to recollect. And sometimes it's also, you know, the recollection procedure, during the recollection procedure, you have hazy recollection, but eventually then you converge to a fixed point, presumably. And I mean, fixed point is a hypothesis, but eventually you can reconstruct and clean that memory, right? And it comes back to you. So the way I think about it is that it's not necessarily the memory itself, but also the context in which you're experiencing the memory that you can think of as the noisy cue. Okay, so conceptually, we can think of the memory scaffold as this underlying attractor manifold that has predefined fixed points that are pre-specified. So because they're pre-specified, there is no information inherently in these points. And so the idea is that basically, since the label layer is k sparse, the total number of states that are possible is NL choose k, which scales exponentially in the number of label neurons. So you can imagine this attractor manifold having NL choose k states, which are scaling exponentially with NL as you increase the dimensionality of the label layer. And in order to store actual information in this network, we can take these features and tag them to each of these attractor states, right? So for instance, if I wanted to remember my dad's favorite shirt, I would tag them to one of the attractor states on this manifold. And similarly, if I wanted to remember someone I met at a conference, I would take another fixed point and tag this memory to that fixed point, and so on and so forth. So what does this lead to? So the key insight is that because we are factorizing the fixed points from the content, we get this very well-spaced minima for storage and recall, which are independent of the content that we are storing, right? So in Hopfield networks, usually you have minima that are not very well-spaced. And as a result, as you are increasing the memories that you're storing, you get this catastrophic drop. But here we've redesigned the minima to be well-spaced, because of which we are able to get this high capacity memory. So we find that mesh exhibits a near optimal CAM continuum. If you store memories that are less than the dimensionality of the hidden layer, then you are able to perfectly recall all of these memories. And as you increase the number of memories that you're storing beyond the dimensionality of the hidden layer, then you get this gradual decay in the information that you can recover per memory. However, this gradual decay is still upper bounded by the total information that you can store in a neural network, which is given by the square of the number of synapses. So again, up to NH, you have perfect recall of all of these memories. As you increase the number of memories that are stored beyond NH, you get partial recovery of each of these memories. And if you continue to store more, you have this gradual degradation of information per memory across this continuum. So the question is, how does this network compare to other networks? And we find that as you're increasing the number of the amount of information stored per synapse in existing networks, the amount of information that you recover per synapse goes down to 0. Whereas in mesh, given a network of fixed size, the total information is actually invariant to the number of stored patterns. So this leads to a smooth trade-off between the number of patterns and the richness of those patterns. We also can show the same thing when storing continuous patterns, still shows gradual degradation, and we have theoretical results in terms of how this degradation scales that you can look at in the paper if you're interested. And if you unroll mesh, it actually starts looking like an autoencoder, with the difference that it has constrained activations in some of its layers, and the learning rules are all biologically plausible. So we compared a mesh to a tail-biting autoencoder, which has also been proposed before to act as a content addressable memory. And we see that in mesh, when you are storing the patterns, and as you increase the number of patterns that you're storing, so here we are storing shirts from a fashion MNIST data set as a proof of concept. So you can see that as you're increasing the number of memories that are being stored, there's a gradual degradation in terms of the information being recovered. But the degradation is such that you can still classify this shirt to its original form, right? You still know that this was this shirt and that this was this shirt. However, if you look at the autoencoder, up to 15 patterns, it performs well. When you go to 300 patterns, you have really basically garbage coming out of the autoencoder such that you can't really classify which shirt you are reconstructing. So notice the contrast between 300 patterns here and the 300 patterns here. So you can also see this numerically. In mesh, we see this gradual decay in information recovered as a function of the number of patterns. However, in autoencoder, we have this catastrophic drop early on. So just to summarize, mesh is a biologically plausible associative memory model without a catastrophic memory cliff and with a gradually decaying memory continuum. It is constructed by constructing a memory scaffold that has predefined attractor states, and the information-laden states are then tagged onto these attractor states. And as I said, it leads to a smooth trade-off between the number of stored memories and the richness of those memories as you're increasing the number of memories that you're storing. So that kind of gives us a solution to building a high capacity memory that has this gradual decay in terms of information that you're recovering per memory as you're increasing the number of memories that you're storing in this network. In the next section, I'm going to show you how entorhinal-hippocampal circuit that we're building is actually implementing mesh, right? And so we are also going to see how the circuit can then lead to compositional representation. So we've solved the memory problem. And the next thing we are looking at is to solve the compositionality problem. All right, so a lot of this work is still work in progress. There's some version of this on bioRxiv, but not all of that, just some components. So I'm going to start by telling you about unification of spatial and episodic memory, because we just talked about memory. And then later I'm going to move towards telling you about mechanisms that can lead to compositional representations in this entorhinal circuit. So it turns out that this grid place network implements mesh. And just to give you some context, grid cells and place cells are the cells in the hippocampal complex in the brain that represent spaces, right? So place cells are in the hippocampus and they fire for particular spaces, and grid cells are these cells in the entorhinal cortex, which encode space in a hexagonal pattern. So it turns out that if we look at mesh, which is on the left, we can very easily show that grid place network actually implements mesh. So you can just take this top key nonlinearity and replace it with this modular attractor dynamics. And the random k-sparse code in this mesh network can be replaced with modular one-hot code in the discrete grid network. Right? So grid cells come in modules, and here I'm showing those modules. And so here I'm showing 3 modules, and these modules are periodic. So grid cells are periodic, they show periodic codes, and here I'm showing different codes. So you can think of this one code as representing one location in space. And as you are representing consecutive locations, you have a periodic code that shifts. So each of these codes are actually representing a bump on a ring, which is shifting as you're navigating through space. And we can also have a 2D version of grid cells where each of these modules is 2D. And in that case, the bump that we're talking about lies on a torus. So, I mean, just to give you a bit of a backstory, I'm presenting it the other way around, but I actually started with modeling the system, and this nice property of high capacity memory and also this gradual decay just fell out. And then we saw that apart from grid codes, there are also other codes like random k-sparse codes that can give us the same properties, right? So it was actually the other way around. And so the question is, what is the advantage of grid code in implementing this high capacity memory? So one advantage is that when we are constructing mesh with random k-sparse codes, we're actually training over all the prior labels in the attractor manifold. But when we are training this attractor manifold using grid code, we only need to train it on a subset, and it automatically generalizes to the entire grid coding space. So here I'm showing a plot. So basically, we know exactly how many states you need to train it on for it to generalize, and that is a function of the period of the biggest module and the number of modules in the grid attractor. And so here I'm showing, as you're increasing the number of patterns that are used for trainings, the number of successfully recovered patterns scale very quickly, right? So even if you're trained only on 200 patterns, you can still reconstruct 1,000 patterns on the memory scaffold. So you already have all the states in the grid coding space stabilized on this attractor manifold without even training on all of them explicitly. And this is because grid code has a structure to it. It is translationally invariant periodic code, which leads to this generalization. The other advantage is that implementing modular one-hot attractors in neural networks is much more robust than implementing k-winner take-all networks. So just to give you a very simple analogy, we can think of this as a hippocampal clothesline, right? Where basically the grid network is helping us build a structured invariant scaffold onto which we can hook external cues, right? So you can think of the spatial map as internal coordinates of where, and the external landmarks are telling us what we are actually storing in that map. So the spatial, we can also do, using this model, we can also do spatial inference in 2D. So if you just look at the first 2 layers, which we had talked about, does implement an underlying memory scaffold. then right now we can just use this for loop closure. So because grid cells have an inherent Euclidean structure, we automatically get this loop closure. So here each point is representing location in space, and this is discretized space. And given external actions as input to the grid attractor network, you can path integrate and compute these grid codes. And eventually, if you give these sets of actions, then the model can automatically predict that it's back to the original starting point, leading to loop closure automatically. And if we add the sensory layer, then we are now adding sensory cues onto these spatial locations, right? So now we can not only do spatial inference, but we can also do non-spatial inference, where these sensory cues are now associated with each of these locations. So as we are going through these locations, we can also predict what sensory cues are associated with each of these locations. So on first pass, we already have the grid cell and place cell codes, because grid cell is being computed through path integration, and place cells are determined through grid cells because they're random projections of grid cells. However, for sensory inputs, we can't yet predict what they are because this is the first pass and we are still learning. But for the last action, after action 6, we can already predict what the sensory input is, again, leading to zero-shot inference because of loop closure. So we can also do novel route inference with this network. So basically, this is another, what I'm showing in red is another example of loop closure. And if you have a novel route, which is shown in blue, which has points that you've already previously visited, then you can very easily compute shortcuts and also infer the sensory stimuli that were associated with these points, right? So for instance, because you've already been at these locations, you can already predict what sensory stimuli you might expect at these locations, irrespective of the fact that you've actually not followed this specific route before. And similarly, you can also infer these shortcuts between points that have been visited before, but not on the same trajectory. So this helps us understand why spatial and episodic memory are co-localized in the brain. So basically, if instead of giving external velocity inputs, we can also learn these actions or transitions on this manifold. And the learning can happen by learning these low-dimensional mappings from either place cells to these action inputs or sensory cells to these action inputs. And so in that case, instead of giving external actions, given your first starting location, the model should be able to reproduce the entire trajectory that you would have taken in that space. So what is the difference between these two connections? Why these two connections? And that's what I'm going to show you here. So basically, we can use the first two layers. Again, recall that these first two layers were being used to generate that memory scaffold, right? And here we have this structured scaffold based on grid cells. And so the first two layers can be used along with this mapping from place cells to actions. The first two layers can be used to construct this internal sequence within the grid coding space. And once you have this internal sequence, you can have arbitrary landmark cues that can be associated with this internal sequence. So this allows you to construct internal sequences that could be used to represent paths in 2D spaces, which we call content-laden sequence. Or you can also use this internal sequence to also encode things like episodic memory, which are also sequences in time. So for instance, here I'm showing the example of the story of the Goldilocks and Three Bears, which you can encode by just storing these associations with the temporal progression of the story with this internal sequence that is generated in the grid coding space. Now, if instead of learning this mapping from place cells to actions, if you learn it from sensory cells to actions, then it becomes like route learning, right? So it's more like stimulus response, where it's similar to saying that, from the house with the brown roof, just turn right, right? So that's another form of spatial inference that people do usually. So the key conceptual insight that you should take from here is basically the fact that here we have translated the sequence memory into memorization of transitions on a spatial scaffold. So instead of learning this high dimensional irregular space, we have learned a low dimensional regular space, right? And we are learning these mappings to actions in a low dimensional space. So you can imagine that, instead of having a recurrent connection here on sensory cells, which would be a high dimensional mapping to a high dimensional mapping, we have this very small low dimensional mapping, which is mapping place cells to maybe 3-dimensional action space. So I'm not showing all the results today, but basically just wanted to say that this is also consistent with the 11 maps for 11 rooms experiment, which was done by Mosers, which shows that, they recorded place cell maps in 11 different rooms. And they showed that all of these place cell maps were actually or had orthogonal representations, kind of suggesting that this system is very high capacity. And that's consistent with what we're proposing. So here I'm showing, place cell maps for 11 rooms for 2 different cells, which are different for, which are different maps across rooms, but they are consistent across visits for the same cell. And we also quantify this by looking at the number of cells as a function of rooms, similar to what they did in their experimental paper. And we find similar results, which suggest that the maps are orthogonal. So this is showing that the number of place cells that are firing across all the rooms decreases as you increase the number of rooms. So this model also predicts directional place fields. So this is an experiment by from David Tank's group, which shows that if you are navigating in a positive direction, then you have, and you sort the fields based on their location on this linear track, then you get this sort of place cell firing map. And if you take the same sorting and try to plot it when the animal is going in the negative direction, then you don't get the same map, right? Which indicates that the animals are encoding the maps differently while they're navigating in positive direction versus while they're navigating in a negative direction. And we get something similar. So in our case, we are encoding these 2 trajectories as separate routes in the grid coding space. And we get, this is just a sample place cell from the model, which fires only in the positive direction and doesn't really fire in the negative direction. And we also get the similar place cell statistics. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was this method of loci, which is very interesting. It's a technique used by memory athletes to remember long lists of items, right? So the technique is basically they build a memory palace, which is a spatial environment that they know about. And so they are basically defining, so they basically first define a path through this environment, and then they associate the items in the list that they want to encode by associating them with different objects along this path. And so when they have to recall this memory palace list, what they do is they imagine themselves navigating through this environment, and they try to recall what objects they see in that environment. And as a result, they try to recall what are the specific list items that they had placed on each of the objects in this environment. So since we have high capacity memory, we can actually associate this memory palace list by adding an additional layer to this model. And what that buys us is basically the fact that we can actually completely deconstruct the memory palace list items, right? So it's basically providing a computational hypothesis for this, for constructing this memory palace. So the way we do it is we associate the reconstructed sensory representations with the memory palace list, right? So the reason we are doing reconstructed is because while the person is imagining themselves walking through the same memory palace, they actually have a vague recollection, right? They might not have a perfect recollection, but they might have partial reconstruction of what they've seen before. And so we take that partial reconstruction and associate it with the memory palace list, which allows us to reconstruct this memory palace list perfectly. So really what's happening conceptually is that there is this 2D path through this memory palace, which in the model we are encoding through encoding these internal sequences in the grid coding space. Then we associate these sequences with these objects in these environments. And then using the third layer, we associate each of these objects, in fact, reconstructions of each of these objects with the memory palace list. So what this buys us is that even though there's a gradual degradation in the reconstructed sensory or landmark inputs, the memory palace list is perfectly reconstructed. All right, so far, we've talked about memory, we've talked about storing discrete memories, we've talked about storing sequences of memories and how we can look at hippocampus now and think about it having unified the spatial and non-spatial memory. And now the question is, how can we generate compositional spatial representations at the neural level, which is the second thing that we were interested in. So there's evidence from neural experiments that continuously traversed spaces have these segmented or disjoint representations at the level of grid cell maps. So if you look at an environment, which is just a square environment, then as the rodent navigates this environment, it forms a nicely tessellated hexagonal grid. However, if you now insert these physical barriers and you look at the grid cell firing maps again, then you see that there's fragmentation across these maps such that the alternate arms have the same firing fields at the same location, but the consecutive arms do not, right? So it seems as if the map is fragmented between consecutive arms, but is repeating across alternate arms. Similarly, in this experiment, when the rodent was traversing this two-room environment connected by a corridor, they found that on short time scales, there's a fragmentation of map between this room and the corridor. And since these two rooms are identical, the map actually repeats across these rooms. So there isn't a globally consistent hexagonal map, but it's fragmented across these boundaries. And so the question is, why does this happen, right? This is giving up key Euclidean representation of the grid cells. We can't do path integration anymore. We can't really compute shortcuts anymore. So what is the functional advantage of this kind of fragmentation? And this kind of fragmentation is not only seen in humans, but it's also seen, it's not only seen in spatial navigation, but it's also seen in many other domains in cognitive science. So there is a series of work by Jeff Sachs where they've shown that, people are constructing schemas or submaps from their everyday experience. And these are kind of frames of understanding the world in the current context, right? So for instance, if you're looking at someone who's assembling Lego blocks, then if there's a part that's occluded by their hand, we can infer that there are probably some Lego blocks that are behind his hand, right? And similarly for a person who's folding the laundry. And you can also, in fact, infer that, the baskets in both of these cases, one might be the Lego basket and the other might be a laundry basket. So there are these frames of understanding that people are building by, taking their continuous stream of experience and segmenting them into structured representations. And we think that these fragmentations that we are seeing in grid cells might also be alluding to the same, right? And we saw in Map Induction that, these compositional representations also have a functional utility in terms of exploration. So we think that grid cells might be a way to generating hierarchical spatial representations in the brain. Here I'm showing our hypothesis, which suggests that in this environment, when we see fragmented maps, it might be that the representations of the animal are switching from this map to this map, and then back to this submap as the animal is traversing this environment, essentially suggesting that the animal might be representing this map as composed of these two submaps. And similarly, in this case, the animal might be representing the environment as composed of these two submaps, where its representation jumps from this map to this map as it's going from room 3 to the corridor, and then back to room 2 with a jump in the representation back with the same map. There's also neural evidence for reusable maps other than these two experiments. So for instance, there's this experiment where these are place maps in these local environments. And if you compose them by connecting them through the corridor, they found that these local maps are still preserved even in the composite environment, right? So that's also additional evidence in favor of compositional maps. What's also interesting is that even though we see these fragmentations at a short time scale, over longer time scales, if you let the animal navigate this environment for a couple hours, then you see this globally consistent formation of maps, right? So this is very intriguing. Like on short time scales, you're fragmenting the maps, but on longer time scales, you form this globally consistent map. And we think that this might be because the animal is combining these small spatial primitives and composing them to form larger spatial primitives, which might be more functionally relevant, given the fact that they're continuously traversing the same motif again and again. Similarly, in this experiment, there was a barrier between two rooms, and Initially, they had independent maps, which were formed in these two rooms, which I'm showing here. And if you remove this barrier, then this is the resultant map that the animal forms. And basically, you can see that there's an interpolation, there's some relaxation in the center, such that you see some locally consistent grid map. However, if you look at the edges, then the grid fields are still preserved along the edges, right? So it's as if the map is anchored at the edges to the original maps, but there's some locally consistent map that's being formed in the middle. And that's what this plot is just showing, the correlation of the final map with the original maps. And here again, you can see that at the edges, the maps are more similar to the previous maps. And in the center, they are less similar to the original maps. So I'm going to build on the previous model that we've seen and take it to a fully continuous regime and show you that this model captures three key findings of the entorhinal map plasticity, which includes grid map fragmentations at instantaneous timescales, interpolation at short timescales leading to locally consistent maps, and map merger at long timescales leading to a globally consistent map, right? And all of this is enshrined within the same architecture. So this is the model. Basically, the grid cells now are implemented using the continuous attractor network, which are basically these networks where each neuron has a Mexican hat connectivity. And this leads to, this connectivity enforces self-excitation and mutual inhibition of neurons around itself. And so this leads to automatic pattern formation. So here I'm showing spatial tuning curves of grid cells from each of these modules. So each of these modules is representing a torus in itself. And this is showing the spatial tuning curves of two of the place cells from the place cell population. And the sensory inputs can be a combination of smoothly varying sensory landmarks, but also boundary vector cells, right? Because the boundary vector cells are known to encode the boundaries. They fire at certain distances and angles from boundaries. So you can think of this layer as getting either boundary vector cell inputs or smoothly varying sensory inputs, or a combination of both. So I'll quickly go over the map fragmentation. So basically, we add a short-term memory to the output of the sensory cells, based on which we compute surprisal, and the short-term memory is encoding an exponentially decaying average of recent sensory inputs. And so basically what this network is doing is just computing the dot product between your current sensory input and your recent past of sensory inputs, and computing surprisal based on it. And here I'm just schematically showing you what happens when the animal traverses from room 1 to room 3. On the bottleneck states are the states where basically the surprisal is very high, and that leads to fragmentation. So initially you have this globally consistent map in room 1, but when you traverse from this region of high surprisal, then you have a remapping event where you remap to another part of the grid coding space and form a new map for this corridor. And then when you come back to room 3, you are looking at long-term memory and figuring out whether you've seen this map or not, which you've also done here, right? So here also you looked at the long-term memory, but since this map didn't exist, you formed a new map. Here you are again querying the long-term memory, but since you've already seen a similar map before, you just pull out the same map and reuse it. So you remap to an existing map rather than initializing a new map, right? And very quickly, this is just a block diagram showing the flow. So basically the surprisal node is inhibiting different connections in this model. So if you just have a velocity input in grid cells, you can path integrate. Under low surprisal, the connections from grid cells to place cells are inhibited, because of which the sensory inputs actually remap your place cells, which also causes remapping in grid cells. Sorry, I just had it the other way around. Sorry, under low surprisal, you're doing path integration. So you're basically just the grid network is integrating your location, and that's driving the place cells. And you can also reconstruct your sensory inputs along the route that you're following. But under high surprisal, you're inhibiting the connections from the grid cells. And so now you have, instead of a continuous movement, you have this abrupt jump in the grid coding space, because the sensory inputs cause remapping in place cells, which is eventually cause remapping in grid cells. Right, so this is, I will skip this and I'll just show you the outputs from the model. So basically, these are some of the outputs from the model, which are showing, the fragmented grid maps, but also the place cell tuning curve. So both grid cell tuning curve and place cell tuning curve as predicted by the model. And also for the hairpin maze, I'm just showing 2 sample grid cells and their firing rates. And these are consistent with the experiments. I think we're kind of out of time, so I'm just gonna jump ahead and just say that, we can also extend this model to model spatial chunking, which allows building bigger primitives from smaller primitives if the composition of the smaller primitives are recurring frequently. And that's happening through these 2 key components, where instead of learning the associations between a given place code and a grid code, we are learning associations between a given place code and a set of grid codes, such that each place cell gets associated not only with a concurrently active place cell, but a series of place cells that were active in a given temporal window before and after this place cell is active. So this together with tethering of the grid face through the sensory inputs actually leads to elastic deformations in the grid cell map, which lead to the formation of a globally consistent map. So here I'm just showing, a simple 1D illustration, and the 2D version of this is still work in progress. But this is just showing that you have room A and room B. And as an agent is traversing across this path, the global phase shift across the laps of the center point of this actually converges to 0. And there are some phase shifts for room A and room B as well. So essentially what's happening is that room A and room B had their initial grid maps, but over time, both of these have phase shifts and they merge into a globally consistent map that has a phase in the middle of these 2 maps. So the final converged map is still related to the original maps, but is different. So that's all. I just want to summarize that we looked at a high capacity memory with gradual decay. So this model has several properties, right? High capacity memory, unification of spatial and episodic memory. We looked at how map fragmentations can happen, which lead to compositional map primitives. And then spatial chunking can lead to formation of bigger primitives by composing these smaller primitives through elastic deformations of the grid map. And we think that this provides a basis for hierarchical representations of space in the brain, which might potentially be useful for things like map induction. So that's all. I just want to quickly thank all of the collaborators who've contributed to this work. Martha, Aiden have contributed to map induction. Sarthak has contributed to the mesh work. Mirko has contributed to fragmented maps. And also Christina has contributed to fragmented maps a lot. And I also want to thank my collaborators from CSAIL who've been engaged with us in discussions about using these representations for planning. And also want to thank my supervisors, Ela and Josh, for their continued support, and my committee members, Matt and Nancy, for their feedback throughout my committee meetings. Thank you. I can take a few questions if people have any questions. Mm-hmm.
How do you exploit people?
Right. So, I mean, so basically, if your expectation doesn't match, even like here, right, for instance, even in this simulation, you see that the initial induced map is very different from the eventual induced map, right? And that's because of mismatch of expectation. And so when your expectation mismatches, you replan, right? So you basically like re-induce the map based on the current observation, such that your new induced map is now consistent with your current observation.
So some studies show that post-traumatic memories seem to be encoded in certain adaptive pathways, distinct from the portable processing by other episodic memories. And I'm wondering if your mesh model needs any modification to account for post-traumatic memories.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So novel, like this question of valence is something that we've been thinking about, because right now the model treats all memories in an equivalent way. But I think this is a very important question, which is, if you have certain memory which has a certain valence, you might want to forget them or remember them based on the valence that's attached to them. That is not yet captured in this memory model, but that's something that we're actively thinking about to incorporate. I mean, I imagine in that case, there'll be two curves, right? So you'll have a different rate of degradation for some memories that have a certain valence attached than other memories. Yeah, so the surprisal is very simple. We're basically the sensory input to the model is the boundary vector cells. So it's basically encoding the geometry of the environment. Potentially, it can also be set like smooth sensory inputs, as I mentioned. But right now, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the recent past of the geometry of the environment and comparing it with my current activations from boundary vector cells, right? So it's basically computing an exponentially decaying average of your recent sensory inputs and comparing it to the current sensory inputs. And if they're similar enough, then you're not surprised. But if they're very different, then you are surprised. And you have to kind of put a threshold as to, what counts as similar enough and what counts as different. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you everyone for coming.